At 10:56 a.m. on Saturday, April 19, 2014, a 911 call was placed from 104th Street in Ozone Park, Queens. The caller, a neighbor, reported what they described as rapid, repeated gunfire, followed by children screaming. Dispatchers coded the incident as a possible domestic dispute involving firearms. Two NYPD units were dispatched immediately. At 11:03 a.m., the first officers arrived at the two-story brick row house. The front door was ajar. Inside the entry hallway, they found the body of a woman lying motionless, face up in a pool of blood. She had sustained multiple gunshot wounds, primarily clustered in the upper torso and facial region. Her hands were empty, with no visible weapon or signs of struggle. Shell casings were strewn across the floor. Two minors, later identified as her children, were outside the residence, visibly distressed but physically unharmed. The woman was later identified as Jessica Canty, age 40. EMS pronounced her dead at 11:07 a.m. A preliminary scene perimeter was secured by 11:10 a.m. No suspect was located on site. Witnesses reported seeing a male leaving the premises in a dark-colored sedan moments after the gunfire ceased. Detectives from the NYPD's 106th Precinct and the Queens Homicide Task Force arrived at the scene shortly afterward. The crime scene unit was mobilized. The living room, hallway, and stairwell all contained blood spatter consistent with multiple close-range discharges of a firearm. Forensic analysis later confirmed 7 9mm shell casings recovered on site, all fired from the same weapon. The entry showed no signs of forced access. There were no broken windows, no signs of a break-in. Nothing was missing. The house was orderly except for the blood and the chaos of the scene. This was not a robbery gone wrong. It was a targeted act. One child, age 6, told responding officers, "Mommy was talking. Then Daddy got loud. Then there was loud booms. Mommy fell." Officers withheld further questioning until Child Protective Services arrived. Both minors were taken into emergency custody that afternoon and transported to a temporary child advocacy center for observation. Jessica's cell phone was found charging on a kitchen counter. A single text message draft was opened but unsent. It read, "I'm scared. He won't stop asking where I go." The phone's call history showed repeated missed calls and text messages from a number later confirmed to belong to her husband, Kevin Canty. Neighbors told investigators that Kevin and Jessica had lived in the house with their children for several years. There had been no prior reported domestic disturbances at the address. One neighbor reported seeing the husband pacing on the sidewalk earlier that morning but thought nothing of it. Another neighbor said she'd heard arguments in the past but never anything violent. Surveillance footage from a corner store 1 block east captured a black sedan leaving the area at approximately 10:59 a.m., traveling southbound. The license plate was partially obscured by sunlight glare, but the vehicle matched the make and model of a car registered to Kevin Canty. As the body was transported for autopsy, the ME's office conducted a cursory field review. The preliminary cause of death was listed as multiple gunshot wounds. No other injuries were present. The entry wounds indicated the shots were fired from less than 4 feet away. By early afternoon, a BOLO, be on the lookout, was issued for Kevin Canty, a former NYPD officer who had retired from service less than a year prior. He was last seen driving a dark Nissan sedan and was believed to be armed and potentially unstable. NYPD intelligence flagged the case as high priority due to the suspect's law enforcement background and firearms training. At 3:48 p.m., he was located and arrested in Brooklyn after attempting to carjack a vehicle on Pitkin Avenue. Officers reported that he appeared emotionally erratic and verbally uncooperative during the arrest. No firearm was recovered at the time of apprehension. He was transferred to the 106th Precinct for initial processing. The weapon used in the shooting was not found at the residence, prompting investigators to initiate a wider search for disposal sites and any additional surveillance footage. Jessica Canty's death marked the 3rd domestic homicide in Queens that year. Her children became material witnesses in an active homicide investigation. And her husband, a man trained by the NYPD, trusted to carry a badge, was now at the center of a manhunt. Jessica Canty, born Jessica Alston, was 40 years old at the time of her death. She worked as a customer service coordinator for a local insurance company in Queens. According to HR records, she had no history of disciplinary action, absenteeism, or reported incidents of workplace conflict. Her personnel file indicated she was punctual, well-liked, and often volunteered to cover shifts for colleagues. She lived with her husband and their children in the Ozone Park neighborhood since 2006. Property records confirm the couple purchased the two-story brick row house jointly under both their names. The mortgage was in good standing with no recent delinquencies or signs of financial distress. Jessica was the mother of 3 children, ages ranging from 4 to 12. Only 2 were present at the time of the shooting. School attendance records showed regular participation and no recent red flags regarding child welfare. Teachers from PS 63 reported that Jessica was actively involved in parent-teacher conferences and after-school programs. She was described as engaged and protective of her children. In the days leading up to her death, there were no reports of threats, harassment, or police calls originating from the residence. A check of NYPD's 311 and 911 systems showed no prior domestic violence reports involving the address or either adult party. However, interviews with close friends and coworkers began to suggest another layer. One coworker stated that Jessica had appeared tense and distracted in the 2 weeks prior to the incident. She reportedly asked for assistance installing a new password on her cell phone and expressed concern about being constantly monitored. Another colleague said Jessica told her, "He keeps asking where I'm going, who I'm talking to. He doesn't believe me when I say I'm at work." The day before the incident, Jessica left work early after receiving multiple text messages. CCTV footage from the office parking lot confirmed she appeared alone and got into her vehicle without incident. The messages on her phone, preserved during the crime scene processing, revealed a pattern of interrogation-style questioning from a single contact labeled K. An initial forensic sweep of Jessica's iPhone uncovered over 200 messages from K in the month leading up to the homicide. Many were benign in tone, others were more accusatory. Several messages included questions such as, "Why didn't you answer at 2:16? And you said you were going to Walgreens, but I saw the car wasn't there." There were no replies from Jessica for several hours preceding the shooting. No response was recorded to the final message sent to her at 10:39 a.m. on the morning of the incident. Jessica's browser history showed multiple visits to web pages related to family law, restraining orders, and spousal surveillance software. She had bookmarked a page about how to document emotional abuse and downloaded a PDF titled "Leaving Safely: Steps for Women in Controlling Relationships." This information was provided to the lead investigator and later introduced in case briefings. A search of her personal email, conducted under warrant, found she had drafted an unsent message addressed to a divorce attorney. The subject line read, "Consultation, re-custody, and safety." It had been saved 2 days before her death. The body of the email was short and clinical, stating only that she wanted to know her rights and whether prior threats would qualify as sufficient for supervised visitation. No further follow-up messages were located. Her autopsy was conducted at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner within 48 hours. The official report, filed under ME case #2014-156782, confirmed death by multiple gunshot wounds to the torso and head. The bullets entered at various angles, suggesting the victim was shot while both standing and as she collapsed. Toxicology returned negative for alcohol, narcotics, or prescription sedatives. No defensive wounds were noted. Fingernails were intact. Gunpowder residue was found on her clothing, consistent with close-range discharge from a semi-automatic pistol. No foreign DNA was recovered beneath her fingernails or on her body. The shooting was swift and deliberate. Medical assessment estimated a time of death within minutes of the first shot, likely before EMS was even dispatched. All evidence pointed to a premeditated attack, carried out with high intent and minimal resistance from the victim. Detectives categorized the crime as a domestic homicide with high proximity indicators. The perpetrator was known to the victim, had access to the premises, and showed signs of a pattern of coercive control in the months leading up to the killing. Forensic techs processed Jessica's home laptop, which had been powered down but intact. Internet history suggested she had been researching job postings outside the state and looking at short-term housing options near Albany. There were no indications she informed her spouse of any such plans. Post-mortem interviews with family members, including Jessica's sister and cousin, painted a similar picture. They described her relationship as tense but private. She rarely disclosed issues directly, but had mentioned feeling watched and suffocated. One relative stated Jessica had once said, "If anything ever happens to me, just know I tried to leave the right way." Those words would later become a critical emotional thread in the legal and social discourse surrounding the case. Kevin Canty was born in Brooklyn in 1971. Public employment records confirmed that he joined the New York City Police Department in 1995 and served until his retirement in 2013. He held the rank of police officer and was assigned to precinct-level patrol for the duration of his service. His personnel file noted satisfactory evaluations, no internal affairs investigations, and a clean disciplinary history. He retired after 18 years of service under medical leave provisions. The reason for his medical leave was later confirmed through court-authorized access to NYPD medical board documents. Canty had been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder and depressive episodes linked to post-traumatic stress. The file also referenced treatment following on-duty exposure to traumatic events, though no single incident was listed as causative. He was cleared for retirement with a partial disability pension. There was no indication that he had been flagged for risk of violence at the time of his departure from the force. Upon retirement, Canty remained in Queens with his family. DMV records indicated he maintained a valid driver's license and owned a registered black Nissan sedan, the same vehicle seen leaving the scene of Jessica's homicide. Investigators obtained a warrant to search his residence of record, a secondary apartment he had rented in East New York approximately 6 months before the shooting. Property managers confirmed the lease was signed by Canty personally, under his legal name. The stated purpose was temporary use during home renovations, though no permits or construction activity were documented at the primary residence. Inside the apartment, officers recovered multiple items relevant to the case. These included a locked strongbox containing a Smith & Wesson 9mm semi-automatic pistol, later matched ballistically to shell casings recovered at the homicide scene, an empty magazine, a partially full box of ammunition, and 2 spare clips. A set of handwritten notes dated over several weeks. Several entries mentioned Jessica by name, citing perceived betrayals, suspicions of infidelity, and statements such as, "If I don't act soon, I'll lose everything." A digital forensics team extracted data from a personal laptop located in the unit. Search history revealed visits to online message boards discussing spousal surveillance and legal consequences of domestic betrayal. Several searches in the week leading up to the shooting included terms such as NY spousal abandonment laws and custody laws if wife cheats. Canty had also accessed GPS tracking software registered to a user account linked to his email address. Investigators confirmed he had installed location monitoring software on Jessica's phone using a third-party app. Logs indicated he had been tracking her location multiple times per day without her explicit consent. Detectives interviewed colleagues from Canty's former precinct. While most described him as quiet and professional, 2 retired officers recalled changes in his demeanor toward the end of his tenure. One noted that Canty had become withdrawn, often speaking about being unappreciated at home. Another described a heated argument Canty had with a superior officer months before retirement, in which he reportedly said, "I don't care if I lose the badge, I just want peace at home." The psychological profile began to form around a pattern of control, distrust, and escalating paranoia. His personal records also showed an absence of social activity post-retirement. He was not known to frequent any clubs, religious groups, or social gatherings. He rarely attended school events for his children. One teacher described him as a shadow, present but disconnected. Financial records were obtained via subpoena and showed no recent strain. Pension checks were being deposited regularly. Utility bills were paid on time, and there were no signs of financial distress. However, Canty had made several cash withdrawals in small increments over the 2 months leading up to the homicide, totaling over $3,500. Investigators believe this may have been tied to his attempt to establish financial independence or to fund eventual separation, though no new bank accounts were found under his name. The picture that emerged was not of a man in financial crisis or legal trouble, but of someone who felt personally destabilized. Surveillance data from the area around Jessica's workplace showed Canty's vehicle parked nearby on 3 separate occasions in the previous month, with no explanation given. When confronted about this in later questioning, Canty offered no comment. Finally, NYPD technicians reviewed Canty's phone records, Location data placed him at the residence on 104th Street between 10:40 and 11 a.m. on the morning of April 19th. The phone disconnected from cellular towers briefly between 11:01 and 11:20, likely due to it being turned off or placed in airplane mode, before reconnecting near Pitkin Avenue in Brooklyn, the site of his later arrest. From a law enforcement perspective, Canty fit a well-documented profile seen in prior domestic homicide cases, a former authority figure experiencing perceived loss of control over his domestic environment, showing signs of coercive surveillance and escalating toward violence as a means of reasserting dominance. At this stage in the investigation, no official charges had yet been filed. The DA's office was reviewing the evidence while Canty remained in custody pending psychological evaluation. At 11:03 a.m., EMS pronounced Jessica Canty dead at the scene. The crime scene unit arrived within 45 minutes and began processing the interior of the two-story residence. The victim's body was located in the main hallway, roughly 8 feet from the front door, lying supine. Blood spatter patterns indicated that at least 3 shots were fired while the victim was standing, followed by additional shots delivered as she fell. 7 9mm Luger shell casings were recovered at the scene. All were consistent with the type used in a Smith & Wesson semi-automatic pistol. The casings were found in a forward arc pattern, suggesting discharge while advancing on the victim. No spent rounds were found lodged in surrounding surfaces, which aligned with ballistic estimates that all rounds struck the target. Crime scene photos documented multiple entry wounds on the torso and upper chest. A single gunshot wound was present on the left cheek. The angle and stippling suggested a range of less than 4 feet. Gunshot residue was later confirmed on the front of Jessica's blouse and on her hands, consistent with passive exposure, not discharge. There were no signs of forced entry. The door lock was intact. The interior showed no evidence of struggle, overturned furniture, or damaged objects. The kitchen was orderly. No knives were missing. Surveillance from the neighboring residence confirmed no one other than the victim and a male adult entered or exited the house between 10:30 and 11 a.m. A forensic technician photographed and collected the victim's cell phone from the kitchen counter. The device was active and unlocked. Text message drafts and recent app activity matched previously recovered metadata. The last text message viewed by the victim had been opened at 10:42 a.m., 12 minutes before the shooting began. Swabs were taken from door handles, light switches, and the weapon holster later recovered from a second location. DNA samples were preserved for comparative analysis. The 2 children, ages 6 and 9, were removed from the scene by CPS representatives and brought to the Queens Child Advocacy Center. A licensed forensic interviewer conducted the initial sessions. Per standard protocol, questioning was non-leading and focused on factual recall. The younger child stated, "Mommy told him to stop. He got mad. Then there were loud pops." When asked how many, the child responded, "A lot. More than 4. The older child added that they had been upstairs when they heard arguing and came downstairs when the sounds began. "He was holding something, pointing it. Mommy was on the floor." Neither child reported being physically harmed. There was no evidence of attempted harm or threats made directly toward them. However, both children were identified as direct witnesses to the fatal shooting of their mother, qualifying them under state law as material witnesses in a domestic homicide. As the investigation expanded, technicians began analyzing location data pulled from mobile tower triangulation logs. The suspect's cell phone pinged off towers in Ozone Park at 10:38 a.m., then dropped offline at 11 a.m. for approximately 20 minutes. At 11:23 a.m., the phone reconnected to a tower near Pitkin Avenue in Brooklyn, 10 blocks from the eventual arrest site. A check of local surveillance systems showed a black Nissan sedan passing multiple intersections on its path out of Queens. No erratic driving was observed. The route taken indicated familiarity with local traffic patterns and knowledge of back roads, suggesting an attempt to avoid detection. The victim's body was transferred to the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for autopsy. The full report, filed under ME case hash 2014-156782, confirmed 7 gunshot entry wounds. The bullets entered at various angles, with 3 in the upper chest, 2 in the abdomen, 1 in the upper left shoulder, and 1 in the left facial area. The cause of death was listed as multiple gunshot wounds with rapid hemorrhagic shock. The manner of death, homicide. Toxicology screens were negative for alcohol, narcotics, or prescription sedatives. No signs of recent injury, bruising, or prior assault were documented. There were no ligature marks or signs of restraint. Fingernail scrapings tested negative for foreign DNA. The autopsy supported the hypothesis of a surprise attack executed with lethal efficiency. The NYPD Domestic Violence Unit reviewed historical records related to both parties. No prior police calls had been placed from the address. Jessica Canty had no documented history of seeking an order of protection. However, digital forensic data, emails, search history, and text messages indicated she was researching separation and custody issues days before the homicide. Detectives classified the case as a high-certainty domestic homicide. The suspect had legal access to the residence, the weapon used was not reported stolen, and the children present had directly named the suspect during early interviews, though such statements would require corroboration under evidentiary standards. The decision was made to expedite review of the weapon. The ballistics lab confirmed within 36 hours that the recovered firearm from the secondary apartment matched the shell casings at the crime scene with 100% certainty. Rifling patterns, discharge residue, and striker impressions were consistent. The firearm was a personal weapon, legally registered to the suspect under his NYPD retirement provisions. He had not reported it missing or stolen. Investigators determined the weapon had not been fired in any other known criminal incidents. The case against the primary suspect was now supported by physical evidence, shell casings, ballistic match, recovered firearm, digital evidence, phone location, surveillance, message logs, witness statements, children on site at time of shooting, forensic pathology, close-range pattern of execution consistent with controlled discharge. From a procedural standpoint, the case had reached the evidentiary threshold for arrest and formal charges. At 3:44 p.m. on April 19, 2014, less than 5 hours after Jessica Canty was shot, NYPD officers from the 75th Precinct received a 911 report of an attempted carjacking near Pitkin Avenue and Shepherd Avenue in Brooklyn. The suspect, described as a black male in his 40s, attempted to forcibly enter a parked vehicle while the driver was inside. The driver escaped on foot and contacted police. A responding patrol unit located the suspect 4 blocks west near Belmont Avenue. Upon approach, the individual matched the description relayed via dispatch and did not resist. He was taken into custody without incident. The arresting officer noted the suspect's clothing was consistent with eyewitness descriptions from the earlier homicide in Queens: dark blue jeans, gray sweatshirt, and black jacket. The subject was unarmed at the time of arrest. He was later identified as Kevin Canty. Officers conducted a standard pat-down and located a smartphone, wallet, and a folding knife in Canty's jacket pocket. The phone was powered on, but locked. After confirmation of identity, Canty was transported to the 106th Precinct in Queens for processing. He was advised of his rights and placed in an interview room pending detective arrival. During transport, the arresting officer recorded that Canty made a single unsolicited statement: "I didn't mean to scare them, just needed her to listen." Back at the precinct, detectives began reconstructing the timeline. Location data from Canty's cell phone placed him near the Canty residence in Ozone Park at 10:42 a.m., consistent with the time of the shooting. At approximately 11 a.m., the phone's GPS signal dropped. Surveillance footage gathered later would place his vehicle leaving the neighborhood at 10:59 a.m. The vehicle in question, a black 2012 Nissan Altima registered to Canty, was located through license plate readers on Conduit Boulevard approximately 30 minutes after the shooting. It was found abandoned in East New York, Brooklyn, and towed to a secure impound facility. A forensic sweep of the car uncovered a black hoodie, latex gloves, and a second cell phone. The gloves tested positive for trace blood consistent with the victim's profile. DNA confirmation would later verify the blood as Jessica Canty's. Back at the station, detectives conducted an initial intake interview. Canty declined legal counsel and agreed to answer basic identification questions. When asked about his location earlier that day, he responded, "I went to the house to talk. I didn't plan anything. It got out of control." When questioned about the weapon, Canty stated that it was registered and that he didn't throw it away. Investigators later recovered the firearm in his East New York apartment, matching it to the weapon used in the shooting through ballistic and serial number analysis. A secondary sweep of Canty's digital devices revealed a pattern of escalating behavior. His primary phone contained deleted messages recovered through forensic software. Many showed obsessive checking on his wife's whereabouts. In one recovered text sent 2 days before the homicide, Canty wrote, "I know you're lying. I've seen where you go." Additional analysis of his call logs showed repeated calls to Jessica in the hours leading up to the shooting. Several went unanswered. He had also used the phone to conduct Google searches for how to access deleted messages from someone else's phone. And can cops track your location if phone is off? Based on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and digital trail, the district attorney's office approved a charge of murder in the second degree under New York penal law, section 125.25, 1, intentional murder without premeditation. Canty was also charged with criminal possession of a weapon in the second degree and endangering the welfare of a child due to the presence of minors at the scene of the homicide. At his arraignment the following morning, Canty entered a plea of not guilty. The court ordered a psychological evaluation before any further proceedings. Bail was denied due to the violent nature of the offense and risk of flight. In parallel, NYPD Child Services initiated proceedings to ensure the protection and temporary placement of the Canty children, now orphans of homicide. The children were placed with extended family under emergency guardianship, and court-ordered trauma counseling began within 72 hours. Internally, NYPD launched a review of its firearm issuance and retirement protocols. Canty had legally retained his service weapon post-retirement. The case triggered internal questions about whether additional screening or monitoring should be applied to retired officers with psychological diagnoses. The homicide unit logged the case as cleared by arrest. However, the broader impact on departmental policy, public trust, and the safety net for domestic violence victims was only beginning to unfold. Following the arrest and formal charges against Kevin Canty, the prosecution team began a detailed review of behavioral patterns and surveillance evidence to assess premeditation, motive, and psychological state. The case file, compiled by the Queens District Attorney's Office, included more than 1,500 pages of investigative material. Central to that file was a forensic timeline documenting Canty's behavioral escalation in the months preceding the homicide. Cell site analysis, authorized through warrant and analyzed by NYPD's Technical Assistance Response Unit, TARU, revealed a pattern of tracking activity. Canty's phone regularly pinged towers near Jessica's workplace during her scheduled hours, despite his not having a job or legitimate reason to be in the area. Between February and April 2014, his phone was detected in proximity to Jessica's office building on 19 separate occasions, often during lunch breaks or after typical business hours. Jessica's phone, by contrast, remained stationary during those times, confirming her presence at work. Further analysis of Canty's internet history revealed repeated visits to websites discussing covert phone monitoring and GPS tracking. A third-party app, not native to Jessica's phone, had been installed on her device without a corresponding entry in her download logs. The app was capable of relaying location data, message previews, and call history to a registered email address. Investigators confirmed that the email was controlled by Canty. Jessica never reported any of these findings to law enforcement. She confided to one coworker that she felt watched all the time and didn't want to make things worse. That coworker later testified that Jessica had recently changed her phone passcode and installed a second email account to begin separating her digital life from Canty's oversight. Canty's behavioral record, examined through former police department records and interviews, also revealed several warning signs. While still on the force, he had filed an internal complaint claiming harassment by his wife's alleged acquaintance, a claim that was dismissed due to lack of corroborating evidence. At least one colleague described Canty as paranoid and preoccupied with what his wife was doing outside the house. These concerns extended beyond Jessica. In March 2014, Canty approached the administration at his children's elementary school and requested to review visitor logs, citing security concerns. Staff denied the request, noting that no external threat had been reported. Days later, he filed a written request for school records, stating that he suspected Jessica was meeting people during school hours. That report was never acted upon. In reviewing Canty's private journals, investigators found dozens of handwritten entries documenting perceived betrayals and imagined threats. Some pages included Jessica's daily routines, including arrival and departure times from work, what she wore, and who she spoke to. On March 21st, he wrote, "She thinks I don't know, but I see it. I hear it in her voice." A forensic psychologist retained by the DA's office later stated, This was a sustained pattern of coercive surveillance. It combined control, fear, and a growing belief that only confrontation would resolve what he perceived as betrayal. It met the clinical threshold for delusional jealousy. The children's recorded statements, gathered by a child forensic interviewer, supported the timeline of escalation. The older child described several incidents where the father would question them about their mother's activities. He would ask me who called her, what she said to people on the phone, if I heard her talking about someone else. The child stated this occurred almost every day. Despite this, Jessica never filed for a protective order or reported emotional abuse. Experts consulted by the prosecution noted that victims of coercive control often fail to recognize the severity of their situation until physical violence occurs. Prosecutors plan to introduce this information under People v. Torres, a precedent-setting case that allowed psychological abuse patterns to be considered as part of intent and motive in domestic homicides. Meanwhile, NYPD's Behavioral Analysis Unit cross-referenced Canty's data with other known domestic homicide cases involving former law enforcement officers. The pattern was consistent: prior control behaviors, monitoring, a lack of external reports, and eventual escalation to lethal violence after perceived abandonment. By the time Canty fired the first shot, the investigation confirmed he had already searched "what happens to cops who kill their wives" on his personal device. The search occurred 3 days before the shooting. This information, combined with his digital trail, ballistic evidence, and surveillance footprint, provided prosecutors with a detailed chain of intent, built not on a single act of violence but on months of psychological destabilization and tracking. The challenge now was to present that data in court without overwhelming the jury and without allowing the defense to claim it was circumstantial or misinterpreted due to a mental health history. The court ordered a psychological evaluation to assess Canty's competence to stand trial and determine whether he understood the nature of his actions. He was transferred to a secure psychiatric facility for a 30-day observation period. The results of that evaluation would dictate whether the case proceeded under standard criminal prosecution or required modification under New York's criminal responsibility statute. Jessica's family was informed of the findings. They reviewed the journal entries, the surveillance history, and the forensic timeline with lead detectives. One relative stated, "She had no idea how far this had gone. None of us did. The system had never intervened because the system was never notified." In the weeks following Kevin Canty's arrest, investigators finalized the digital forensics review of Jessica Canty's communications, cloud backups, and personal devices. The findings confirmed what prosecutors had begun to suspect. There was no evidence that Jessica had engaged in any extramarital relationship, past or present. All digital interactions were accounted for and involved family, work colleagues, or longtime friends. None contained language suggesting romantic involvement, secrecy, or infidelity. Messages previously interpreted by Canty as suspicious were re-examined in context. One thread involved a conversation with a female coworker named Renee regarding a carpool arrangement. Canty had flagged this as evidence of lies about where she went, but geolocation data confirmed Jessica's phone moved along the exact route discussed in the conversation. Another instance involved a brief voicemail left by a male from her office. The man in his 60s was later identified as her supervisor, and the content of the message was strictly professional. Jessica's internet history also provided no indication of hidden accounts, encrypted messaging apps, or secretive searches. Instead, her browser data reflected searches for housing options in Albany, how to file for separation safely, and dealing with obsessive spouses. These searches aligned chronologically with periods when Canty's tracking activity was most intense. The psychological profile compiled by the court-appointed forensic psychiatrist further supported the absence of actual betrayal. The final report, submitted to the DA's office, concluded that Kevin Canty exhibited symptoms consistent with Othello syndrome, a rare but documented condition involving delusional jealousy. Individuals with this disorder hold fixed beliefs of infidelity without objective evidence and often engage in obsessive monitoring behaviors. The condition is not a legal defense, but it provided the court with critical context. During pretrial motion hearings, the prosecution presented this pattern to argue intent and awareness of wrongdoing, despite any mental health claims. Their position was clear. While Canty's beliefs may have been distorted, he took conscious, deliberate actions, tracking, planning, arming himself, and ultimately executing a controlled, repeated act of violence. His behavior demonstrated not loss of control, but escalation based on false certainty. The defense, led by a public defender with experience in mental health litigation, sought to frame Canty's actions under diminished capacity. They acknowledged his long-standing anxiety and paranoia, bolstered by his retirement due to psychological trauma. The defense petitioned for a plea deal, citing a lack of prior violence, psychiatric documentation, and Canty's willingness to accept guilt. Negotiations extended over several sessions. The prosecution refused to reduce the charge below murder in the second degree, but agreed to remove the possibility of life without parole in exchange for a full confession, waiver of appeal, and a detailed admission of premeditated conduct. The final plea was entered in open court 3 months after the homicide. On the morning of the hearing, Canty stood in a Queens County courtroom, wearing standard correctional attire. With no jury present, he acknowledged each charge before the judge. When asked if he understood the nature of the plea and the rights he was waiving, he replied, "Yes, Your Honor." When asked to explain what happened on April 19, 2014, he stated, "I believed she was lying. I was wrong. I kept checking where she went. I couldn't stop. I thought she was going to leave and take the kids. I didn't think straight, but I knew what I was doing." The judge accepted the plea and sentenced Canty to 25 years in state prison with no possibility of early release. The sentence included mandatory mental health treatment while incarcerated. The courtroom remained silent, except for the sobs of family members seated in the gallery. Jessica's sister later told the press, "He didn't lose control. He lost his grip on reality, but he still knew what he was doing." As part of the sentencing agreement, Canty relinquished parental rights to his children, who were later placed under permanent guardianship with Jessica's extended family. A no-contact order was established, prohibiting all communication between Canty and the children during and after incarceration. The resolution of the legal process did not mark the end of public inquiry. The case became a touchpoint for discussions on coercive control, mental illness in former law enforcement personnel, and the legal gray zone where obsession becomes justification in the minds of offenders. While the law did not recognize a delusion as a defense, it did acknowledge its role in motivating behavior. For prosecutors, the case was notable not because the murder was concealed, but because the motive was constructed entirely from belief that no evidence could support, but that proved fatal nonetheless. The sentencing of Kevin Canty in late 2014 closed the legal proceedings, but the social and institutional consequences of the case unfolded over years. Jessica Canty was not only a homicide victim, she became a symbol in local and state discussions surrounding coercive control, officer mental health, and the system's failure to recognize warning signs in domestic dynamics that fall short of physical abuse. The Canty children, placed under permanent guardianship with Jessica's relatives, began court-ordered trauma counseling within a week of the sentencing. According to family impact statements submitted later for public record, both children exhibited signs of post-traumatic stress, recurring nightmares, and difficulty trusting adults, especially male authority figures. The older child requested to legally change their surname, a motion that was granted to shield their identity and separate them from public discourse around the case. Jessica's extended family began participating in advocacy programs within Queens County, emphasizing public education on non-physical abuse warning signs, such as digital tracking, emotional coercion, and surveillance behaviors, none of which had been actionable by law enforcement prior to the murder. Internally, the New York Police Department launched a formal review of its retirement firearm policies for former officers. Kevin Canty had legally retained his service weapon post-retirement, even with a known psychological diagnosis on file. In 2015, NYPD updated its early intervention program guidelines, expanding mental health screenings and requiring mandatory evaluations for officers applying to retain issued firearms upon separation from duty. A concurrent initiative, partnered with the Department of Mental Health and Hygiene, was launched to monitor former officers with prior internal mental health referrals. The aim was not punitive, but preventative, to establish a risk monitoring framework that extended beyond an officer's final day on duty. The Queens District Attorney's Office, following the Canty case, began piloting an internal review protocol that flags cases involving accusations of stalking, coercive behavior, and excessive surveillance in domestic settings, even in the absence of prior violence. Under this model, prosecutors receive specialized briefings on how psychological manipulation may precede physical harm, particularly in relationships where the aggressor has legal training or law enforcement experience. Public reaction to the case shifted as more details emerged. Initially reported as a domestic dispute turned deadly, the story evolved into a larger conversation around the invisible threshold of danger when fear exists but bruises don't. Editorials in the New York Times, City and State, and the Daily News called attention to gaps in domestic violence policy, especially where victims avoid reporting abuse due to emotional dependence, shame, or fear of escalation. Jessica's employer, a regional insurance firm, established an internal domestic violence resource program, providing all employees with access to legal assistance, counseling, and emergency relocation funds if needed. Her department renamed its annual Community Service Award in her honor. In Albany, legislation was introduced under the proposed Coercive Control Recognition Act, which aimed to define patterns of non-physical domestic abuse, such as GPS stalking, digital surveillance, and intimidation through control of finances or communication, as admissible evidence in restraining order hearings and criminal cases. Though the bill stalled in committee that year, it marked a legislative milestone in recognizing psychological abuse as a precursor to physical violence. As for Kevin Canty, he is serving his sentence in a medium security facility in upstate New York. According to Department of Corrections records, he has no visitors on file and is enrolled in a mandatory mental health treatment program. He is eligible for reevaluation of his treatment status every 2 years, but ineligible for parole. The final legal and investigative files on the Canty case are now closed, but the questions it raised remain open. How should the justice system treat invisible forms of abuse? When does obsessive behavior become dangerous? And who exactly is responsible for noticing the signs before someone pulls the trigger? 10 shots were fired on 104th Street. None of them were random. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.